This is going to be a lot of books. So strap yourselves in, grab yourself a cuppa, get a notebook and a pen, and come along for the ride. This is the SCAREathon recommendations. Okay, so this is going to be a lot of books. This video is going to talk about some specific prompts that I have created that may be a little bit more difficult. I encourage you to leave your own suggestions in the comments below. The only other thing that I'm going to mention before we start is I will be, while some of these prompts I'm putting in one area, they will work for others. So if they do work for other areas, I will let you know. With that being said, let's get started. The first one that I have put on the list is Painted by Kirsten McKenzie. Now, this is a New Zealand author. I will put the Amazon link to her book down below. And this follows Anita, who is a junior in an art appraisal firm, and this whole firm doesn't listen to the instructions that they've been told when it comes to cataloguing an estate, which is a house that is essentially full to the brim full of artwork. And so they go and they catalogue quite haphazardly, and this releases a spirit or a ghost or a soul that was captured in a painting. And now that he's been released, he really doesn't want to go back in the painting. So this is a horror, also described as a thriller. It would work for cabin because it is in an isolated setting. It is 296 pages. The next one is The Carrow Haunt by Darcy Coates. And this one follows Remy, who is a tour guide. And Remy has really not seen any paranormal activity that makes this house famous until she shows around this group of researchers that is there for a week. Again, it would work for a cabin. It is a horror mystery. It is a ghost story in every respect, and it is 372 pages. Next, we have Come Out, Come Out by Natalie C. Parker, and this is a queer horror centered around a group of teenagers that do not feel safe coming out to their friends, their families, their parents. And so they seek refuge in an abandoned house in the woods, and they form this little group where they can just be themselves and not be judged. One of them goes missing, however, and 5 years later, a spirit that they all once invoked has come back to haunt them. This is a YA horror. It is queer. From Goodreads, it calls out the systems that erase queer and trans identity. 336 pages. For a couple of classics, first we have The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, and I feel like everybody knows the story of Sleepy Hollow, but for those who don't, when a school teacher finds himself in the Glen of Sleepy Hollow, he finds himself terrified by the ghost stories that the children and also the town has told him, and this causes him to rush through the woods on his way home. Unfortunately, he gets caught out one night, and he meets the one and only Legend of Sleepy Hollow himself. This is a horror. It is a classic. It is also probably classed as a short story, being only 108 pages. It is probably a story that everybody knows, but not one that everybody has read. Our next classic is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and again, this is a ghost story in every respect. It follows an occult scholar and his assistant, a friendless woman who knows a lot about poltergeists, and the heir to Hill House. Now things start out pretty general with like doors slamming and closing and kind of knocking. That kind of stuff But then eventually Hill House just kind of starts building up energy and building up energy, and eventually the house decides that one of the group must stay there forever. So this is a horror. It was made into a Netflix series, but I cannot guarantee that it was any good. I have not seen it. The premise of it kind of reminds me of some of like the old school ghost movies, like The Haunting, also Rose Red, which is one of my favorite ghost movies ever. That kind of thing. It is quite short. It is 182 pages. So finally, one that is maybe a little bit outside the box, but definitely fits, is The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. Now, this follows Susie, who was murdered as, I believe she was 12 or 13. So it's told from her perspective as she kind of adjusts and gets used to her new life in heaven. So she is reliving her story as well as observing her friends and her family and also her murderer. And essentially, when she's observing, all she can do is watch. This is heartbreaking, and yet it is so full of hope and joy, and yet it is suspenseful and filled with drama. It is a contemporary mystery. Arguably, this could also work for Cabin and also Stark. It is 372 pages. Speaking of Stark, first we have House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas, and now this is the alternate cover, this one right here. I do not count the other covers in this series because there's quite a lot going on in those covers, but this one absolutely does count. And it follows Bryce, who is a party goer, a pleasure seeker, a lover of life. And then all of a sudden a murder happens that brings her world crashing right down. And the bars she once frequented for pleasure are now there to offer oblivion and escape. Soon, when a fallen angel is tasked to watch her every step, they fight to uncover the mystery of not only the murders, there has been more than one murder at this point, but also their own dark pasts. It is a romantasy. It's Sarah J. Maas. It is definitely a romantasy. It is book one in the series, and it is a whopping 779 pages. There are some chunkers in here. The next one is Magician by Raymond E. Feist, and I will say very quickly that this is kind of stretching it. This is kind of stretching the prompt a bit because there is quite a few things in this, but mostly it's just this black here. And for this one, meet Pug. That is his name. It is Pug. Once an orphan, and then a sorcerer's apprentice, and then a slave to a race of war people from another planet. Now, while he's on this other planet, he learns to harness magic that is kind of deep within himself, and he learns how to control that magic. And eventually he fights an ancient fight that is, quote, older than time itself. Described as an epic fantasy, published in 1982, so it is kind of classic. It is 841 pages. The next book I want to talk about is a little complicated. That is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. And what do I say about this book? So essentially there are two different stories going on. One is the Navidson record, and that follows a family who moves into this house that's kind of, I would say it's isolated, so this would work for Cabin. Basically, like, they're filming and stuff like that, but the house is bigger on the inside, like measurably bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. And so they start investigating and things get really weird, and there's this creepy corridor of abyss that is just inside this closet. And so they start investigating further into that abyss, and then like I think the house starts changing and things just get scarier and scarier, and all the while they're recording all of these. The second story follows this journalist, and you're seeing this through footnotes. Uh, and so he's kind of telling the history of what happened to this family and also what happened to people that have been in possession of these records. You kind of start seeing him lose the plot as the book goes on as well, I'm pretty sure. Um, Definitely a horror. Would definitely freak me out if I read it completely in the evening. Hint, hint. Um, probably would probably work for most people for exercise, uh, because for a lot of people reading this book, it tends to wig them out, and it's really weird. Um, so it's kind of a mind fuck. It would also work for Cabin, like I said. This copy that I've got is 662 pages, which includes the two appendices, which I have heard that you need to read in order to fully understand what's going on. It does exclude the mammoth index. Next, we have 1984 by George Orwell, and I have not read this, but it is. Y'all, we could be. We could be interrupted by some pretty severe thunder. Anyway, I have not read this classic, but from the look of it, it follows a man that is following a love affair through like these different states, um, and it's about war and power struggle, and there's a government that controls not only information but also memories as well. Um, and yeah, through all of this, he's just trying to pursue a love affair. It is dystopian sci-fi, definitely a classic, published in 1949, and it is 368 pages. So the next book we have for Stark, and again, this is kind of like stretching the prompt a little bit, but I will accept it. That is Yellowface by Rebecca F. Kuang. This is about an author called June Hayward who witnesses the death of her friend and fellow author Athena. Now, June decides to take Athena's new manuscript and edit it, and essentially sells this masterpiece of a book as her own, and it's not. And eventually people find out, and they they threaten her through Twitter, and things turn dicey. And this threat claim to bring her to justice in one way or another. Takes a dark comedy but very important look at behind the scenes in the publishing industry, with a well crafted and very fast read story. It is contemporary, it is literary fiction, it is 323 pages. Just quickly, the inspiration between Stark was actually this cover. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in New Zealand we have the Penguin books with these kind of orange and white covers. And this cover is slapped on loads of different books. Like I had the Great Gatsby in this cover. Dracula is also in this cover on our bookshelves. The Secret History. Very, very minimalist, very stark, and essentially you cannot judge the book by its cover when it looks like this. So yes, I will accept anything this with this cover as well. First off, we're going to start with Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. And this is set in an isolated cabin on the New Hampshire lake with apparently 2 miles any direction to reach any neighbor. And so we have this young girl and her family that moves into this cabin, And one day, while this girl is playing in the yard, it's probably more like an acre, um, she's approached by a man and they start chatting. Eventually, there are these other people that come up, um, and it just so happens that this man that's been talking to the daughter yells out to the parents saying that they must let these people in and help them save the world. This is a horror thriller. I think it could get quite gory if it's anything like Cabin in the Woods. I don't know, maybe it was inspired by that. It's 304 pages. Next, we have Shutter Island by Dennis Lehane. And this I'm quite interested to read. It is set in the backdrop of 1950s, follows a US Marshal and his partner that go to Shutter Island and the Ashcliffe Hospital for the criminally insane. And essentially there has been a woman that has gone missing. There's been a disappearance of a woman from her locked room that is constantly under surveillance somehow. This book depicts pretty horrible and gruesome experiments and surgeries, and there are many twists and turns that will kind of leave you wondering who the real victim is and leave you asking what is actually going on. It is a mystery thriller crime novel. It's 369 pages. Speaking of asylums, this book is called The Asylum by John Harwood, and this follows a woman known to be Georgia Ferris, or is she? She has no memory of how she got there, only that she voluntarily committed herself under the name of Lucy Ashton. When she insists her name is Georgina, her uncle comments that Georgina is home with him. From the Isle of Wight to the passages of the remote Tregennan house, this patient finds herself unraveling family secrets in order to survive. This is a historical fiction. It is a thriller mystery, 257 pages. A classic that I wanted to mention, that's maybe a little more outside the box, is The Wicker Man by Robin Hardy. And this is a movie to book adaptation. It was released in 1978. So this follows Police Sergeant Neil Howie, and he's lured to the remote island of Summerisle, where he is on the trail of a missing young girl. May Day approaches, and things start becoming really weird and ritualistic, and the whole town on Summerisle is just a bit sketchy. And he begins to think that she has been used as some kind of human sacrifice. It is a horror, and it is 304 pages. Some honourable mentions. We have Andy Weir. Now, most of his books are set in space, and if there is any more isolated place in the world than space, please let me know, because that to me is the very definition of isolated. So pretty much any Andy Weir book that is set in space, or any book that is set in space, will work for this. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I still cannot say that name, because first off, Mary in the beginning with her parents is isolated from society. She essentially lives in her room, and that's it. Even when she goes to her uncle's in England, the manor itself is quite isolated, let alone the fact that it's a huge house, and for the most part, she is by her own. Now, eventually she does find children to play with, but then the garden itself, the secret garden, it's secret, it's isolated. It takes quite a while to be able to find it. Now, my final book for cabin is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. And are we surprised if you've been around my channel? Not really. This is an incredibly isolating book. It is such a good read, but it is incredibly isolating. First off, Piranesi lives in a labyrinth, and it is essentially only him, and this place is huge. Like, the bottom floor of this labyrinth, or this house, is a sea, if that kind of gives you any indication of how big this place is. And yeah, mostly it's just him. There is one other person for a lot of this book, but Piranesi only sees him once every 2 weeks. And so they agree to do some research into finding some secrets, but he discovers more secrets and more things that are going on than what he originally planned. And so this eventually changes the very shape of his reality, as he knows it. It is fantasy, magical realism, it is definitely literary fiction. Would be a very good book for exercise, because for 75% of the book, you don't have any clue what is going on. You can make theories. Most of your theories are probably going to be wrong. It is 245 pages. So next we have Candy Cane for dark fairy tale retellings, and I am going to put ACOTAR on this. This is a dark Beauty and the Beast retelling. And I do just mean the first book for this. The second book is a Hades and Persephone retelling, but I don't think it's really dark. So we kind of all know now what ACOTAR is. Girl kills wolf, then girl gets taken by big scary hybrid creature thing, and then said creature, who is Tamlin, is actually the High Lord of the Spring Court. Ultimatum is to stay with him in serious luxury, or family gets killed back home. There's an even bigger baddie that threatens the whole land. So when a deal expires on Tamlin's part, it is up to Feyre to save the day. It is a romantasy. It is a book top bestie, and it is 419 pages. So next we have Crimson Bound by Rosamund Hodge, and this is a dark, loose retelling of Red Riding Hood. Rachel or Rochelle, not sure how you pronounce that, at 15 years old, was a good girl. She was apprenticing to protect her village from dark magic, evil, but she strayed a little too far in the woods one day, and met her fate off the forest path. And when I say met her fate, she was given a choice. So she had to make a decision that ultimately saw her serving the realm to atone for her encounter with the bad guys, if we haven't figured that out. In order to kill the king's son, sees an unlikely alliance that has both of them fighting to save the entire world. This is a YA, it is a fantasy romance, 464 pages. Looking now at the Villains series by Serena Valentino, and this is looking at some of Disney's most iconic villains and delves into their backstory and what really makes them evil. Ranging from middle grade to YA, these books are anywhere between 200 to 400 pages each. This could also make a good resting book for a break. And honourable mention also goes to the Twisted Tales series by Liz Braswell, which twists the classic Disney tales on their heads and asks the question, what if? Also a shout out to Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire, looking at the backstory of Elphaba, which is the Wicked Witch herself, and while darkening some of the backstories for some of the other characters within the Oz universe. So next we have The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Core, and this is, I would say, for part of it, a dark Little Mermaid retelling, sort of. But here the mermaids have teeth, and they have devoured the prince's kingdom. So there is also a plague doctor, ageless children, and the saints that control them. This is horror fantasy. It's also LGBT. More of a reimagining, I think, of like lots of different fairy tales and fables. It is short at 106 pages. So the next one is Changeling by Victor Lavelle. And this follows Apollo from a young boy who loses his father and inherits a fox named Improbabilia, to a man who has built a business dealing in books and starting a family of his own. Now, slowly, exhaustion and postpartum depression exhibit themselves. Apollo's nightmares return. Emma, who's the wife and mother, starts going a little cuckoo, until one day she finally snaps and does something absolutely unthinkable before vanishing. Now he must find his wife and baby in a world completely different than his own. It does have multiple trigger warnings, so do take care when reading. It is a horror, fantasy, magical realism. Would arguably also work for Kevin, as part of this story takes place on a forgotten island. 431 pages. One of the biggest zombie books, probably arguably, is World War Z by Max Brooks. I would say it's the ultimate zombie book. So fascinating in the fact that it tells the survival of the human race, through interviews from people all over the world. Looking at cities that were millions in populations that were absolutely decimated and are now inhospitable. This is likely to be on my TBR for this one. It is a horror, sci-fi, probably a bit gory. Would also work for Attack because it's a war, humans, zombies. It's 342 pages. Next we have, for zombies, Resident Evil by S.D. Perry. Now this is a series of novels that are based on the video games. It explores Raccoon City and the Umbrella Corporation that did hideous genetic experiments resulting in the creation of a virus that caused mutations basically in anything living. This is an interesting option if you like the video games or the movies. It is a horror, will probably definitely be gory, ranges from 250 to 300 pages per book, depending on which one you pick up. Now the next one is Cell by Stephen King, and this follows Clay Riddle, who finds himself in the heart of Boston when, quote, all hell breaks loose. There isn't much of a synopsis here, but it describes humans regressing back to basic animalistic destructive instincts, and the apocalypse begins with the ring of a cell phone. It is horror. It is also post-apocalyptic, so I think it works both for zombie and dystopian. 449 pages. We have The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and I am going to put The Stand in here as well by Stephen King because they are both very similar. Very different page counts, but very similar in idea. A virus wipes out most of the world. Those that are left must travel to find safety, survival, and other life. I've not read The Road. I did read The Stand, which was very much a good versus evil trope, like for the second half of it. Dystopian. The Road is 241 pages. The Stand is 1327 pages, so make your choice. If you want the real good points, go for The Stand. Next we have Children of Men by P.D. James, and this is a story of a world with no children and no future. Lovely. This follows an infertile world with the final generation now being adults. Theodore is an Oxford historian who is witnessing the world crumble, but then he is approached by a woman wanting an audience with his cousin, who is like really high up. And so she and her band of people may just hold the key to his will to live and also the survival of the human race. It is dystopian sci-fi, 241 pages. Next we have The Giver by Lois Lowry. This follows Jonas, who is a 12-year-old boy living in seeming utopia. He is chosen to receive training from the giver to receive the true memories of his society, joy and pain and everything in between. It is a YA dystopian, 203 pages. It is also a classic. For some honourable mentions, of course, we have George Orwell with 1984 and Animal Farm, both of which would work and are labelled as dystopian. Of course, how could I not mention Margaret Atwood with The Handmaid's Tale? This one is incredibly well known, very dystopian, very disturbing, well worth a read. Obviously, there's the Hunger Games quadrilogy, if you wanted to go there as well. That would work. There's also the Divergent series, if you wanted to read that as well. So there's quite a few when it comes to dystopian. So first, and I do want to give a shout out to Gavin because some of these did come from Gavin's video. I will link it up here. First, we have Full Immersion by Gemma Armour. A traumatized woman with amnesia finds her own dead body and sets out to discover the truth of her demise. Magpie, how's that for a name? Discovers her own dead body on a misty Bristol morning. She travels through multiple realities, experimental treatments, and technological advances, and half memories in a race to find out what happened. She is accompanied by a strange yet familiar friend, and together they run to escape the silhouette in order to find the truth of her past. It is a horror sci-fi. Again, this would work for Kevin. I would also argue that it would work for Seeing Ghosts as well. 352 pages. Next, we have The Last Days of Jack Sparks by Jason Arnott. And Jack died while writing this book. That's fun. This deals with a journalist who has essentially copped a Twitter shitstorm, X now, after witnessing an exorcism as research for his new book. Until a video makes its way onto YouTube from his account, Jack insists that he did not make it, despite being posted from his account. It is horror, paranormal, 336 pages. Bright Young Woman is another one by Jessica Knoll, and this follows a sorority in Florida State University, particularly Pamela, who was invited out but decided to stay in, and this actually ended up saving her life. So she wakes up at 3 o'clock in the morning to find 2 of her sisters dead and 2 of them seriously injured. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Tina is investigating the disappearance of her friend when she hears about the tragedy in Florida. So Tina travels to Florida and she essentially knows who's done it. So they team up, Tina and Pamela, and it becomes a mammoth pursuit of truth and justice. It is a mystery thriller historical, 384 pages. Transmuted by Eva Harms. This follows Isa, a transgender woman's journey as she fundraises for gender affirming surgery. That dream is put on hold when she gets some terrible news and she has to reinvest that money. But then she answers a sketchy advert in a newspaper that offers her free experimental treatment, basically. And although the methods are severe, she finally feels comfortable in her own skin until her body starts to mutate. This is horror. This is LGBT. It's another short one at 113 pages. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer is an interesting one in an area that has been retaken by nature. Expeditions are sent to Area X. Now, each expedition comes back different. The first one comes back absolutely fine, but then all of these people start getting affected in different ways and worse and worse. Some results are more sinister than others. This story focuses on Expedition 12, where 4 women are tasked to observe and map out the terrain. while also avoiding being contaminated. This is eco-horror, sci-fi, fantasy. This would work well for Contaminate as well. It is 195 pages. Green Fuse Burning by Tiffany Morris. This follows Rita, who has just lost her father. Unbeknownst to her, her girlfriend has won her an artist residency to go and paint in a secluded cabin for a week. This just so happens to be the cabin that her father grew up in. From the very beginning, she starts hearing and seeing things, particularly concerning the forest lake and the swamp that surrounds it. It is horror, it is LGBT, Indigenous rep. Let's say it with me, it work for cabin. It is 104 pages. One that's kind of out of the box a little bit is 1,000 Nights by E.K. Johnston. Now, this is a dark retelling of, I believe it's Arabian Nights. It follows a girl that has been taken wife by a murderer. She sits in his court every day thinking death is surely to come for her, but instead he comes to listen to her stories, and slowly she begins to realize that he is not as bad as he has always been. This is YA fantasy romance. It would also work for Candy Cane. 324 pages. Now I'm going to start with honorable mentions in this round. The Hunger Games is definitely a predominantly war-themed book. Well, the whole series is. Also, Tomorrow When the War Began series. Tomorrow When the War Began is actually a fantastic series. It's an Australian series. Both are dystopian, they're both YA, pretty easy to read, ranging from 300 to 450 pages, depending on the book. Highly recommend both reads if you haven't picked them up. They're amazing. Next, we're going to start off with Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. This tells the story of the sinking of a German cruise liner by a Soviet submarine. This cruise liner was meant to ferry soldiers and refugees to safety from the Red Army. It is told through 4 voices, each starting individually but converges on this ship. With over 10,000 passengers, the ship was grossly overcrowded. The approximate capacity was 1,800. Over 9,000 people lost their lives. This is historical. 391 pages. Next, we have Now I Am Here by Chidi Abir. And this is a book that starts at the end where an unnamed narrator, and I think that's quite interesting, and his unit are surrounded with essentially no chance for victory. Now, he turns to confessions and recounts his past. From gentleman to war criminal, this book tells of acts the narrator never thought he could possibly commit. It is obviously a war, I would say probably historical fiction. It's 172 pages. Now, how can we talk about war without mentioning these 2 epics? Now, the first one is The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. Anne Frank is 13 years old when her family flee from their home and go into hiding within an office building wall. Now, this is what many Jewish families had to do in the horror of World War II. This is ultimately a slice of life book with a grueling and honest look into what it took to hopefully, maybe not, survive. It is a non-fiction, it is a classic. Serious trigger warnings, so please do be mindful. It is 283 pages. Now, the next iconic book that I want to talk about is Schindler's List or Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally. And Oskar Schindler was a flamboyant womanizer in the shadow of Auschwitz. He became a legend and a savior to so many Jewish people. As an Aryan, He continuously risked his life, outsmarted and defied the SS in order to protect the Jews in Nazi-occupied Poland. This is a non-fiction. It is a war book. Again, zero trigger warnings. It is 429 pages. Now let's look outside the box a little bit to some fantasy epics. There are many fantasy epics that are centered around war. Game of Thrones is one that I can think of at the top of my head. But you've also got Poppy War, the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson, and of course Lord of the Rings. Now Lord of the Rings is a little bit of a stretch, but if there is as much battling in the books as there are in the movies, then I will accept it. I have not read the books yet, but I am going to put Lord of the Rings on war just based off what I've seen in the movies. If you want to use Akor, A Court of Wings and Ruin, this one here, and only this one, I will accept that. But no other book from the series I will accept, just because this really does center around the war. So next we have Reap, and for this one I'm going to start off with the Arc of a Scythe series by Neil Shusterman. Now, this is in a world where humans have conquered everything. We're talking about hunger, disease, misery, war, and even death. And so scythes are these people that are commanded to end lives in order to keep the population balanced. And they are the only people that can take lives. These two teenagers are chosen for such a role, and we follow them as they train to either kill or risk being killed themselves. This is a YA fantasy. It would also work for Contaminate, as it is dystopian. 435 pages. Next, we have Masters of Death by Oliver Blake, and this has many supernatural creatures. It has vampires, ghosts, demons, other things, but it also has death and reapers as well. Now, Death's godson is a main character, and his name is Fox, and when Viola, who's a vampire, meets him, she's requesting his mediumship services to rid a mansion of its amnesiac ghost. It is a fanro. It is apparently LGBT, urban fantasy, 384 pages. Now, without spoiling it too much, if you haven't read this, I am putting The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak on here. If you know, you know. Death has never been busier and will be busier still. While visiting her brother's grave, Liesl finds a book and takes it, thus beginning a life of book thievery, hence The Book Thief, and a love affair with books. So soon she begins stealing books that are meant to be burnt in Nazi book burnings as well. Again, if you know, you know why this has made it onto the list. I don't really want to spoil it, because when I first found out, I was like, whoa, I didn't expect it. So yeah, I'm going to leave that there. It is historical fiction. It is YA. It's also a classic. 550 pages. Now, a few books that are a little off the beaten path, but I'm counting. One of them is the Death Note volumes by Tsugumi Oba, translated by Puki Rolf, and this centers around an A-grade student called Light Yagami, who comes across a notebook that just so happens to be dropped by a death god. Any human whose name is written in the book dies. So to me, not only is the book related to a death god, but it makes any owner of that notebook like an angel of death, because they are bringing on the death of said person who is in the notebook. Hence why it's on this list. They're about 200 pages each, and as there is no page minimum or point loss for graphic novel or manga, it could be a nice quick read. Now, the next one that's a little bit off the beaten path is Tales of Beedle the Bard by J.K. Rowling, and this book was actually mentioned in Harry Potter 7, The Deathly Hallows. that's because the Deathly Hallows is a tale within the tales of Beedle the Bard. That was very complicated. And it's probably one of the most famous stories, where it's about three brothers who cheat Death himself. Now this is a light option for people who need a break. But there may also be some discomfort when it comes to reading from that particular author. Not necessarily the book. The book is 105 pages. Finally, we have Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs by Caitlin Doty. Caitlin is a mortician, and she is a YouTuber as well, who has been answering questions and normalizing death for many years. Death is a subject that is rather taboo, especially in real life, especially when it's close to home, but it happens to everyone. So she explores rituals from ancient Egypt, skeletal science, and other rather morbid topics in this funny, honest, and mildly confrontational nonfiction. It is 232 pages. We have reached the end of that list. That was a lot of books. Believe me, that wasn't all the books that I initially wrote down, but I kind of narrowed it down to those. So I hope they gave you some good ideas of what books that you can pick for those prompts. Let me know in the comments below what books you would suggest for any of the prompts that I have mentioned. Stay tuned for my TBR, because I will be going through all the books that I will be reading for those prompts. Until then, happy reading, everyone. Bye bye.